Chapter 13 of Black Ivory by R. M. Ballantyne. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Encampment and the Supper. Discussions, political and otherwise. Kambira receives a shock, and our wanderers are thrown into perplexity. Turn we now to a more peaceful scene. The camp is almost quiet. The stars are twinkling brightly overhead. The fires are glimmering fitfully below. The natives, having taken the edge off their appetites, have stretched their dusky forms on their sleeping mats, and laid their woolly heads on their little wooden pillows. The only persons moving are Harold Seadrift and Disco Lillihammer, the first being busy making notes in a small book, the second being equally busy in manufacturing cloudlets from his unfailing pipe, gazing the while with much interest at his note-making companion. "They was pretty vigorous when they was at it, sir," said Disco, in reference to supper, observing that his companion looked up from his book, "but they was sooner done than I had expected." "Yes, they weren't long about it," replied Harold, with an abstracted air, as he resumed his writing. Lest the reader should erroneously imagine that supper is over, it is necessary to explain what taking the edge off a free African's appetite means. On reaching camp after the cutting up of the elephant, as detailed in the last chapter, the negroes had set to work to roast and boil with a degree of vigour that would have surprised even the chefs de cuisine of the world's first-class hotels. Having gorged themselves to an extent that civilised people might perhaps have thought dangerous, they had then commenced an uproarious dance, accompanied by stentorian songs, which soon reduced them to the condition of beings who needed repose. Proceeding upon the principle of overcoming temptation by giving way to it, they at once lay down and went to sleep. It was during this stage of the night's proceedings that Disco foolishly imagined that supper had come to a close. Not many minutes after the observation was made, and before the black cutty pipe was smoked out, first one and then another of the sleepers awoke, and after a yawn or two, got up to rouse the fires and put on the cooking pots. In less than a quarter of an hour the whole camp was astir. Conversation was rife, and the bubbling of pots that had not got time to cool, and the hissing of roasts whose fat had not yet hardened, mingled with songs whose echoes were still floating in the brains of the wild inhabitants of the surrounding jungle. Roasting, boiling, and eating were recommenced with as much energy as if the feast had only just begun. Kambira, having roused himself, gave orders to one of his men, who brought one of the elephant's feet and set about the cooking of it at Harold's fire. Kambira and Disco, with Antonio and Jumbo, sat round the same fire. There was a hole in the ground close beside them which contained a small fire. The embers of this were stirred up and replenished with fuel. When the inside was thoroughly heated, the elephant's foot was placed in it and covered over with hot ashes and soil, and another fire kindled above the hole. Harold, who regarded this proceeding with some surprise, said to Kambira, through Antonio, "Who are you cooking that for?" "For my white guests," replied the chief. "But we have supped already," said Harold. "We have already eaten as much as we can hold of the elephant's trunk and tongue, both of which were excellent. Why prepare more?" "This is not for to-night, but for to-morrow," returned Kambira with a smile. "The foot takes all night to cook." This was a sufficient explanation, and in truth the nature of the dish required that it should be well done. When, on the morrow, they were called to partake of it, they found that it was, according to Disco's estimation, "fust rate." It was a whitish mass, slightly gelatinous, and sweet like marrow, and very palatable. Nevertheless, they learned from experience that, if the effect of bile were to be avoided, a long march was necessary after a meal of elephant's foot. Meanwhile the proceedings of the natives were food enough for our travellers for the time being. Like human creatures elsewhere, they displayed great variety of taste. Some preferred boiled meat, others roast. A few indulged in porridge made of mapira meal. The meal was very good, but the porridge was doubtful owing to the cookery. It would appear that in Africa, as in England, woman excels in the culinary art. At all events, the mapira meal was better managed by them than by the men. On the present occasion the hunters tumbled in the meal by handfuls in rapid succession as soon as the water was hot, until it became too thick to be stirred about. Then it was lifted off the fire, and one man held the pot while another plied the porridge stick with all his might to prevent the solid mass from being burnt. Thus it was prepared, and thus eaten in enormous quantities. No wonder that dancing and profuse perspiration were esteemed a necessary adjunct to feeding. At the close of the second edition of supper, which went into 4 or 5 editions before morning, some of the men at the fire next to that of Kambira engaged in a debate so furious that the curiosity of Disco and Harold was excited, and they caused Antonio to translate much of what was said. It is not possible to give a connected account of this debate as translated by Antonio. To overcome the difficulty, we shall give the substance of it in what Disco styled Antonio's lingo. There were about a dozen natives round the fire, but 2 of them sustained the chief part in the debate. One of these was a large man with a flat nose. The other was a small man with a large frizzy head. "Hold oos tongue," said Flatnose, so Antonio named him. "Tongue too long, far." "Boh, oos brains too short," retorted Frizzyhead contemptuously. An immense amount of chattering by the others followed these pithy remarks of the principals. The question in debate was, whether the 2 toes of the ostrich represented the thumb and forefinger in man, or the little and ring fingers. But in a few minutes the subject changed gradually, and somehow unaccountably, to questions of a political nature. For, strange to say, in savage Africa, as in civilised England, politics are keenly discussed, doubtless at times with equal wisdom in the one land as in the other. "What dat 'oo say?" inquired Flatnose on hearing some muttered remarks of Frizzyhead in reference to the misgovernment of chiefs. Of course there, as here, present company was understood to be excepted. "Chiefs ob no use at all," said Frizzyhead so vehemently that the men at several of the nearest fires ceased to talk and began to listen. "Ob no use?" cried Flatnose with vehemence so superior that the attention of the whole camp was arrested. "No," replied Frizzyhead, still more energetically, "ob no use at all. We could govern ourselves betterer, so what de use of 'em? The chief ums fat and hab plenty wife, but we who do all de hard work hab hunger and only one wife, prehaps none at all. Dis is bad, unjust, wrong." There was a general shout of "ee" from all quarters, which was equivalent to our "hear, hear." "Oh no, notting at all," retorted Flatnose, who was a loyal subject. "Is not de chief de fader of de people? Can there be people widout a fader, eh? God made de chief. Who says dat chief is not wise? He is wise, but ums childum am big fools." Kambira nodded his head and smiled at this, and there was a general inclination on the part of most of the audience to applaud, for there, as elsewhere, men have a tendency to be blown about by every wind of doctrine. It was amusing to observe the earnestness and freedom with which men of the lowest grade assaulted the opinions of their betters on this occasion. Unable at other times, or in any other way, to bring themselves into importance, they were glad of the opportunity to do so with their tongues, and, like their civilised types, they assumed an air of mock modesty. "Oh!" cried one of these in reply to Flatnose, "we is little infants, we is still holdin' onto de bosoms ob our moders. We will not be able to walk alone, we knows notting at all, but on dis point we knows that you old men speak like de ignorant people. We neber hear such nonsense, neber." No notice was taken of this, but Frizzyhead, whose passion was rising to white heat in consequence of the glibness of his opponent's tongue, cried out, "O cannot prove what O's says." "Oh yes, can prove it well 'nuff," replied Flatnose, but oo's no got brain for onderstand." This last was too much for poor Frizzyhead, who leaped up, stuttered, and cried, "Can oo outrun me, then?" "Yes," gasped Flatnose, springing up. Away they went like 200 springboks, and ran for a mile, then turned and came back into camp streaming with perspiration, little Frizzyhead far ahead of the big man, and rejoicing in the fact that he could beat his opponent in a race, if not in an argument. Thus was peace restored. Pity that civilised arguments cannot be terminated in the same way. While these discussions were going on, Disco observed that hyenas were occasionally to be seen prowling near the verge of the bushes around them, as if anxious to join in the feast, which no doubt was the case. "Don't they do mischief sometimes?" he inquired of Antonio. "No, him a cowardly beast. Him come at mens while sleeping or dying, but not at odder time. Or like see me catch 'em?" "Why, yes, if he can do it," answered Disco, with a slight look of contempt at his friend, who bore too much resemblance in some points to the hyena. "Come here, den." They went together into the jungle a little distance, and halted under the branch of a large tree. To this Antonio suspended a lump of raw flesh, at such a height from the ground that a hyena could only reach it by leaping. Directly underneath it he planted a short spear in the earth, with its point upward. "Now come back to the fire," he said to Disco. "Oo soon hear sometin'." Antonio was right. In a short time afterwards a sharp yell was heard, and, on running to the trap, they found a hyena in its death agonies. It had leaped at the meat, missed it, and come down on the spear and impaled itself. "Well, of all the fellers I've ever knowed for dodges," said Disco, on reseating himself at the fire, "the men in these latitudes are the cleverest." By this time dancing was going on furiously; therefore, as it would have been impossible to sleep, Disco refilled his pipe, and amused himself by contemplating the intelligent countenance of Kambira, who sat smoking bang out of a huge native meerschaum on the other side of the fire. "I wonder," said Harold, who lay stretched on a sleeping mat, leaning on his right arm, and gazing contemplatively at the glowing heart of the fire, "I wonder what has become of Yoosoof." "Was he thinking that he deserved to be shoved in there?" asked Disco, pointing to the fire. "Not exactly," replied Harold, laughing, "but I have frequently thought of the scoundrel, and wondered where he is, and what doing now. I have sometimes thought, too, about that girl Azinte, poor thing. She " He paused abruptly and gazed at Kambira with great surprise, not unmixed with alarm, for the chief had suddenly dropped his pipe and glared at him in a manner that cannot be described. Disco observed the change also, and was about to speak when Kambira sprang over the fire and seized Harold by the arm. There was something in the movement, however, which forbade the idea of an attack, therefore he lay still. "What now, Kambira?" he said. "Antonio," cried the chief in a voice that brought the interpreter to his side in a twinkling, "what name did the white man speak just now?" "Azinte," said Harold, rising to a sitting posture. Kambira sat down, drew up his knees to his chin, and clasped his hands round them. "Tell me all you know about Azinte," he said in a low, firm voice. It was evident that the chief was endeavouring to restrain some powerful feeling, for his face, black though it was, indicated a distinct degree of pallor, and his lips were firmly compressed together. Harold, therefore, much surprised as well as interested, related the little he knew about the poor girl, his meeting with her in Yoosoof's hut, Disco's kindness to her, and her subsequent departure with the Arab. Kambira sat motionless until he had finished. "Do you know where she is gone?" he inquired. "No, I know not, but she was not in the boat with the other slaves when we sailed, from which I think it likely that she remained upon the coast. But why do you ask, Kambira? Why are you so anxious about her?" "She is my wife," muttered the chief between his teeth, and, as he said so, a frown that was absolutely diabolical settled down on his features. For some minutes there was a dead silence, for both Harold and Disco felt intuitively that to offer consolation or hope were out of the question. Presently Kambira raised his head, and a smile chased the frown away as he said, "You have been kind to Azinte. Will you be kind to her husband?" "We should be indeed unworthy the name of Englishmen if we said no to that," replied Harold, glancing at Disco, who nodded approval. "Good. Will you take me with you to the shores of the Great Salt Lake?" said Kambira in a low, pathetic tone. "Will you make me your servant, your slave?" "Most gladly will I take you with me as a friend," returned Harold. "I need not ask why you wish to go," he added. "You go to seek Azinte?" "Yes," cried the chief, springing up wildly and drawing himself up to his full height. "I go to seek Azinte. Ho! Up, men, up! Ye have feasted enough and slept enough for one night. Who knows but the slavers may be at our huts while we lie idly here? Up! Let us go!" The ringing tones acted like a magic spell. Savage camps are soon pitched and sooner raised. In a few minutes the obedient hunters had bundled up all their possessions, and in less than a quarter of an hour the whole band was tracking its way by moonlight through the pathless jungle. The pace at which they travelled home was much more rapid than that at which they had set out on their expedition. Somehow the vigorous tones in which Kambira had given command to break up the camp, coupled with his words, roused the idea that he must have received information of danger threatening the village, and some of the more anxious husbands and fathers, unable to restrain themselves, left the party altogether and ran back the whole way. To their great relief, however, they found on arriving that all was quiet. The women were singing and at work in the fields, the children shouting at play, and the men at their wonted occupation of weaving cotton cloth, or making nets and bows, under the banyan trees. Perplexity is not a pleasant condition of existence; nevertheless, to perplexity mankind is more or less doomed in every period of life and in every mundane scene, particularly in the jungles of Central Africa, as Harold and his friends found out many a time to their cost. On arriving at the native village, the chief point that perplexed our hero there was as to whether he should return to the coast at once, or push on further into the interior. On the one hand, he wished very much to see more of the land and its inhabitants. On the other hand, Kambira was painfully anxious to proceed at once to the coast in search of his lost wife, and pressed him to set off without delay. The chief was rather an exception in regard to his feelings on this point. Most other African potentates had several wives, and in the event of losing one of them might have found consolation in the others. But Kambira had never apparently thought of taking another wife after the loss of Azinte, and the only comfort he had was in his little boy, who bore a strong resemblance in some points to the mother. But although Harold felt strong sympathy with the man, and would have gone a long way out of his course to aid him, he could not avoid perceiving that the case was almost, if not altogether, a hopeless one. He had no idea to what part of the coast Azinte had been taken. For all he knew to the contrary, she might have been long ago shipped off to the northern markets, and probably was, even while he talked of her, the inmate of an Arab harem, or, at all events, a piece of goods, a chattel, in the absolute possession of an irresponsible master. Besides the improbability of Kambira ever hearing what had become of his wife, or to what part of the earth she had been transported, there was also the difficulty of devising any definite course of action for the chief himself, because the instant he should venture to leave the protection of the Englishmen, he would be certain to fall into the hands of Arabs or Portuguese, and become enslaved. Much of this Harold had not the heart to explain to him. He dwelt, however, pretty strongly on the latter contingency, though without producing much effect. Death, the chief replied, he did not fear, and slavery could easily be exchanged for death. "Alas, not so easily as you think," said Harold, pointing to Chimbolo, whose sad story he had heard. They will try every kind of torture before they kill you." Chimbolo nodded his head, assenting, and ground his teeth together fiercely when this was said. Still Kambira was unmoved. He did not care what they did to him. Azinte was as life to him, and to search for her he would go in spite of every consideration. Harold prevailed on him, however, to agree to wait until he should have spent another month in visiting Chimbolo's tribe, after which he promised faithfully to return and take him along with his party to the coast. Neither Harold nor Disco was quite at ease in his mind after making this arrangement, but they both agreed that no other course could be pursued, the former saying with a sigh that there was no help for it, and the latter asserting with a grunt that the thing was unavoidable. On the following day the journey of exploration was resumed. Kambira accompanied his friends a few miles on the road, and then bade them farewell. On the summit of an elevated ridge the party halted and looked back. Kambira's manly form could be seen leaning on his spear. Behind him the little village lay embosomed in luxuriant verdure, and glowing in the bright sunshine, while songs and sounds of industry floated towards them like a sweet melody. It was with a feeling of keen regret that the travellers turned away after waving their hands in reply to a parting salute from the stalwart chief, and, descending to the plain, pushed forward into the unknown wilderness beyond. Chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 14 of Black Ivory by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Camping, traveling, shooting, dreaming, poetizing, philosophizing, and surprising in equatorial Africa. At sunset the travellers halted in a peculiarly wild spot, and encamped under the shelter of a gigantic baobab tree. Two rousing fires were quickly kindled, round which the natives busied themselves in preparing supper, while their leaders sat down, the one to write up his journal, the other to smoke his pipe. "Well, sir," said Disco, after a few puffs delivered with extreme satisfaction, "you do seem for to enjoy writin'. You go at that log of yours every night as if it was your last will and testament that you couldn't die happy without executin' and signin' it with your blood." "A better occupation, isn't it?" replied Harold, with a sly glance, "than to make a chimney pot of my mouth?" "Come, sir," returned Disco, with a deprecatory smile, "don't be too hard on a poor feller's pipe. If you can't enjoy it, that's no argiment against it." "How do you know I can't enjoy it?" "Why, 'cause I s'pose you'd take to it if you did." "Did you enjoy it when you first began?" asked Harold. "Well, I can't 'zactly say as I did." "Well, then, if you didn't, that proves it is not natural to smoke, and why should I acquire an unnatural and useless habit?" "Useless! Why, sir, only tink of what you loses by not smokin'. What a deal of enjoyment!" "Well, I am thinking," replied Harold, affecting a look of profound thoughtfulness, "but I can't quite make it out. Enjoyment? Let me see. Do I not enjoy as good health as you do?" "Oh, certainly, sir, certainly. You're quite up to the mark in that respect." "Well, then, I enjoy my food as well, and can eat as much, can't I?" "No doubt of it," replied Disco, with a grin. "I was used to be considered rather a dab at wittles, but I must say I knocks under to you, sir." "Very good," rejoined Harold, laughing. "Then as to sleep, I enjoy sleep quite as soundly as yourself, don't I?" "I can't say as to that," replied Disco. "You see, sir, as I never opens my eyes arter shuttin' 'em till the bo's'n pipes all hands ahoy, I've no means of knowin' what you accomplish in that way." "On the whole, then, it seems that I enjoy everything as much as you do, and " "No, not everything. You don't enjoy baccy, you know. But please, sir, don't go for to moralise. I can't stand it. You'll spile my pipe if you do." "Well, I shall spare you," said Harold, "all the more that I perceive supper is about." At that moment Antonio, who had gone down to a streamlet which trickled close at hand, gave utterance to a hideous yell, and came rushing into camp with a face that was pea green for terror. "Ach!" he gasped, "a lion! Queek, your guns!" Every one leaped up and seized his weapon with marvellous alacrity on receiving an alarm so violent and unlooked for. "Where away?" inquired Disco, blazing with excitement, and ready at a moment's notice to rush into the jungle and fire both barrels at whatever should present itself. "No, no, don't go," cried Antonio in alarm. "Be cautionous." The interpreter's caution was enforced by Chimbolo, who laid his hand on Disco's arm and looked at him with such solemnity that he felt it necessary to restrain his ardour. Meanwhile, Antonio with trembling steps led Harold to a point in the thicket whence he beheld two bright, phosphoric looking objects, which his companion said were the lion's eyes, adding that lion's eyes always shone in that way. Harold threw forward his rifle with the intention of taking aim, but lowered it quickly, for he felt convinced that no lion could possibly have eyes so wide apart unless its head were as large as that of an elephant. "Nonsense, Antonio," he said, laughing, "that cannot be a lion." "Oh, yes, him's a lion for sure," Antonio returned positively. "We shall see." Harold raised his rifle and fired, while Antonio turned and fled, fully expecting the wounded beast to spring. Harold himself half looked for some such act, and shrank behind a bush by way of precaution, but when the smoke cleared away, he saw that the two glowing eyes were gazing at him as fixedly as ever. "Pooh!" exclaimed Disco, brushing past, "I knows wot it is. Many a time I've seed 'em in the West Injies." Saying which, he went straight up to the supposed lion, picked up a couple of glow worms, and brought them to the camp fires, much to the amusement of the men, especially of Jumbo, and greatly to the confusion of the valorous interpreter, who, according to his invariable custom when danger threatened, was found to have sought refuge in a tree. This incident furnished ground for much discussion and merriment during supper, in which Antonio, being in no wise ashamed of himself, joined noisily, and Chimbolo took occasion to reprove Disco for his rashness, telling him that it was impossible to kill lions in the jungle during the darkness of night, and that if they did pay them a visit, it would be wise to let them be, and trust to the camp fires keeping them at a respectful distance. To which Disco retorted that he didn't believe there was any lions in Afriky, for he'd heard a good deal about 'em, and travelled far, but had not yet heard the sound of their voices, and what was more, didn't expect to. Before that night was far advanced, Disco was constrained to acknowledge himself in error, for a veritable lion did actually prowl down to the camp, and salute them with a roar which had a wonderfully awe-inspiring effect on every member of the party, especially on those who heard it for the first time in their lives. Just before the arrival of this nocturnal visitor, one of the men had been engaged in some poetic effusions, which claim preliminary notice here, because they were rudely terminated by the lion. This man was one of Kambira's people, and had joined the party by permission. He was one of those beings who, gifted with something like genius, or with superior powers of some sort, have sprung up in Africa as elsewhere, no doubt from time immemorial, to dazzle their fellows for a little, and then pass away, leaving a trail of tradition behind them. The existence there in time past of men and mind far in advance of their fellows, as well as of heroes whose physical powers were marvellous, may be assumed from the fact that some such exist at the present time, as well as from tradition. Some of these heroes have excited the admiration of large districts by their wisdom, others by their courage or their superior dexterity with the spear and bow, like William Tell and Robin Hood. But the memory of these must soon have been obliterated for want of literature. The man who had joined Harold was a poet and a musician. He was an improvisatore, composed verses on the incidents that occurred as they travelled along, and sang them with an accompaniment on an instrument called the sanza. which had 9 iron keys and a calabash for a sounding board. The poet's name was Mokompa. With the free and easy disposition of his race, he allowed his fancy to play round the facts of which he sang, and was never at a loss, for, if the right word did not come readily, he spun out the measure with musical sounds, which meant nothing at all. After supper was over, or rather when the first interval of repose occurred, Mokompa, who was an obliging and hearty little fellow, was called on for a song. Nothing loath, he seized his sansa and began a ditty, of which the following, given by Antonio, may be regarded as a remarkably free, not to say easy, translation. Mokompa's Song. Kambira goes to hunt, yo ho! Him spear am never blunt, yo ho! Him kill de buffalo quick, and lub de porridge thick. Him chase de lion too, and stuck 'em true and true. De potamus as well, and more dan me can tell. Have down before 'em fell, yo ho! De English come to see, yo ho! Dat werry good for we, yo ho! No take us 'way for slaves, nor put us in our graves, but set de black mans free, when cotch 'em on de sea. Dem splendid shooters too, we knows what dey can do, wid boil and roast and stew, yo ho! One makes 'em's gun go crack, yo ho! An elephant on 'em's back, yo ho! De drayful lion roar, de gun goes crack once more, de bullet fly and splits one monkey into bits, yo ho! De glowworm next arise, de Englishman likewise, wid werry much surprise, and hit 'em 'tween de eyes. Hooray! hooray! Cries, and run to fetch 'em's prize, yo ho! The last yo ho was given with tremendous energy, and followed by peals of laughter. It was at this point that the veritable lion thought proper to join in, which he did, as we have said, with a roar so tremendous that it not only put a sudden stop to the music, but filled the party with so much alarm that they sprang to their arms with surprising agility. Mindful of Chimbolo's previous warning, neither Harold nor Disco sought to advance, but both looked at their savage friend for advice. Now, in some parts of Africa there exists a popular belief that the souls of departed chiefs enter into lions and render them sacred, and several members of Harold Seadrift's party entertained this notion. Chimbolo was one of these. From the sounds of growling and rending which issued from the thicket, he knew that the lion in question was devouring part of their buffalo meat which had been hung on the branch of a neighbouring tree, not, however, near enough to the fires to be visible. Believing that the beast was a chief in disguise, Chimbolo advanced a little towards the place where he was, and, much to our travellers' amusement, gave him a good scolding. "You call yourself a chief, do you, eh?" he said sternly. "What kind of a chief can you be to come sneaking about in the dark like this, trying to steal our buffalo meat? Are you not ashamed of yourself? A pretty chief, truly! You are like the scavenger beetle. And think of yourself only. You have not the heart of a chief. Why don't you kill your own beef? You must have a stone in your chest, and no heart at all." "That's werry flowery lingo, but it don't seem to convince him," said Disco, with a quiet smile, as the lion, which had been growling continuously over its meal all the time, wound up Chimbolo's speech with another terrific roar. At this point another believer in transmigration of souls, a quiet man who seldom volunteered remarks on any subject, stepped forward and began seriously to expostulate with the lion. "It is very wrong of you," he said, "to treat strangers in this fashion. You might have more respect for Englishmen who have come to see your land, and never did you any harm. We are travelling peaceably through the country. We never kill anybody, and never steal anything. The buffalo meat is ours, not yours, and it ill becomes a great chief like you to be prowling about in the dark, like a hyena, trying to steal the meat of strangers. Surely you can hunt for yourself. There is plenty of meat in the forest." Note. See Livingstone's Zambesi and its Tributaries, page 160. As the lion was equally deaf to this man's reasoning, Harold thought it right to try a more persuasive plan. He drew up in a line all the men who had guns, and at a word of command they fired a volley of balls into the jungle in the direction whence the sounds issued. A dead silence followed, but it was deemed advisable not to venture in to see the effect, as men had frequently lost their lives by so doing. A watch, however, was kept during the night, and the fires were well replenished, for they knew that the king of the forest usually shrinks from doing his evil deeds in the light of a strong camp fire. We say usually, because they are not always thus shy. Authentic instances are on record of lions having leaped into the centre of a bivouac and carried off one of the men in spite of being smitten in the face with flaming firebrands. Fortunately the lion of which we write thought discretion the better part of valour. He retired peaceably. Nevertheless, Disco and his friend continued to dream of him all night so vividly that they started up several times and seized their rifles, under the impression that he had roared his loudest into their very ears, and after each of these occasions they crept back into their sleeping bags to re-dream of the lion. The bag which formed each man's couch was made up simply of two mats sewed together, and left open, not at one of the ends, but at one of the sides, so that a man could roll out of or into it more easily than he could have slid feet first into a sack. It was large enough also for two to sleep inside together, always supposing that the two were of accommodating dispositions. That they had now reached a land which swarmed with wild animals was intimated to some extent by the running past, within 50 yards of their bivouac, of a troop of elephants. It was daybreak at the time, so that, having been thus rudely aroused, they did not deem it necessary to return to rest, but after taking a hasty mouthful of food, set forth on their journey. The usual mode of proceeding on the march was as follows. They rose up about 5 o'clock, or soon after the appearance of dawn, and swallowed a cup of tea with a bit of biscuit. Then some of the men folded up the blankets and stowed them away in the bags, others tied up the cooking utensils, etc., in bundles, and hung them at the ends of carrying sticks which they bore upon their shoulders. The process did not take long. They were soon on the march, either in single file, if the path were narrow, or in groups according to fancy, where the ground admitted of their spreading out. About 9 a convenient spot was chosen for a halt to breakfast, which meat, although not eaten the night before in order to save time in the morning, was at all events cooked on the previous evening for the same end, so that it only needed warming up. Then the march was resumed. A short rest was allowed in the heat of the day, when, of course, Disco had a pipe, and much sagacious intercourse with his fellows, and they finally encamped for the remainder of the day and night early in the afternoon. Thus they travelled 5 or 6 hours at a stretch, and averaged from 12 to 15 miles a day, which is about as much as Europeans can stand in hot climate without being oppressed. This Disco called taking it easy, and so it was when compared with the custom of some travellers, whose chief end would appear to be the getting over as much ground as possible in a given time, in order that they may afterwards boast of the same, and for the accomplishment of which they are obliged to abuse and look ferocious at the blacks, cock their pistols, and flourish their whips, in a manner which is only worthy of being styled contemptible and cowardly. We need not say that our friends Harold and Disco had no such propensities. They had kindly consideration for the feelings of their niggers, coupled with great firmness, became very sociable with them, and thus got hearty, willing work out of them. But to return from this digression. During the day the number of animals of all sorts that were seen was so great as to induce Disco to protest, with a slap of his thigh, that the whole land, from stem to stern, seemed to him to be one prodigious zoological garden. It did, and no mistake about it. Disco was not far wrong. He and Harold, having started ahead of the party, with Chimbolo as their guide, came on a wonderful variety of creatures in rapid succession. First they fell in with some large flocks of guinea fowl, and shot a few for dinner. As they advanced, various birds ran across their path, and clouds of turtle doves filled the air with the blatter of their wings as they rose above the trees. Ducks, geese, and francolins helped to swell the chorus of sounds. When the sun rose and sent a flood of light over a wide and richly wooded vale, into which they were about to descend, a herd of pallas stood gazing at the travellers in stupid surprise, and allowed them to approach within 60 yards before trotting leisurely away. These and all other animals were passed unmolested, as the party had sufficient meat at that time, and Harold made it a point not to permit his followers to shoot animals for the mere sake of sport, though several of them were uncommonly anxious to do so. Soon afterwards a herd of waterbucks were passed, and then a herd of kodos, with 2 or 3 magnificently horned bucks amongst them, which hurried off to the hillsides on seeing the travellers. Antelopes also were seen, and buffaloes grazing beside their path. Ere long they came upon a small pond with a couple of elephants standing on its brink, cooling their huge sides by drawing water into their trunks and throwing it all over themselves. Behind these were several herds of zebras and waterbucks, all of which took to flight on getting the wind of man. They seemed intuitively to know that he was an enemy. Wild pigs also were common, and troops of monkeys, large and small, barked, chattered, grinned, and made faces among the trees. After pitching the camp each afternoon, and having had a mouthful of biscuit, the 2 Englishmen were in the habit of going off to hunt for the daily supply of fresh meat, accompanied by Chimbolo as their guide and game carrier, Antonio as their interpreter, and Mokompa as their poet and jester. They did not indeed appoint Mokompa to that post of honour, but the little worthy took it upon himself, for the express purpose of noting the deeds of the white men, in order to throw his black comrades into convulsions over supper by a poetic recital of the same. "It pleases them, and it don't hurt us," was Disco's observation on this head. On the afternoon, then, of which we write, the party of 4 went out to hunt, while the encampment was being prepared by the superintendence of Jumbo, who had already proved himself to be an able manager and cook, as also had his countrymen Masiko and Zombo. "What a rich country!" exclaimed Harold, looking round in admiration from the top of a small hillock on as fine a scene as one could wish to behold. "And what a splendid cotton country it might be if properly cultivated." "So it is," said Disco, "and I shouldn't wonder if there was lots of gold too, if we only knew where to look for it." "Gold!" exclaimed Antonio, who sat winking placidly on the stump of a fallen tree. "Der be lots of gold near Zambesi, and odder ting too." "Let's hear what are some of the other things," said Disco. "What are dere? Oh, let me see. Der be coal, lots of coal on Zambesi, any amount of it, and it burn first rate too. Der be iron ore, very much, and indigo, and sugar cane, and ivory. You habs hear and see yourself about de elephants and de cotton and tobacco." Note. See Livingstone's Zambesi and its Tributaries, page 52. "Oh, great plenty of everyting everywhere in this yer country, but," said Antonio, with a shrug of his shoulders, "no can make noting out of it on account of de slave trade." "Then I s'pose 'ee don't approve of the slave trade?" said Disco. "No, dat am true," replied Antonio. "De country very good for slave trader, but no good for man like me what want to trade proper." "Humph! I've more respect for 'ee than I had," said Disco. "I s'pose you've been up in these parts before now, have ye?" "No, never, but I have sister what marry one nigger one slave what sold himself, and him tell me much about it. Him's been up here many time." "Sold himself!" repeated Harold in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Mean dat," returned Antonio. "Him was a black free man call him Chibanti. Him was all alone in de world, lose fader, mudder, brudder, sister, wife, eberyting by slave trader, who steal them all away or murder them. So Chibanti say, `What de use of be free?' So him go to one master who berry good to him's niggers, give him plenty to eat and little to do, and sold himself to him." "And what did he get for himself?" asked Disco. got 90 yard ob cotton cloth." "Did he consider himself cheap or dear at that?" inquired Disco. "Oh, dear, awful dear." "What has come of him now?" asked Harold. "Dunno," answered Antonio. "After him got de cloth, him's master send him to Quillimane wid cargo ob ivory, and gib him leave to do littil trade on him's own account. So him bought a man, a woman, and a boy, for 60 yard ob cotton, and wid de rest hired slaves for de voyage down, and drove a most wonderful trade. But long time since me hear ob him. P'raps him's good master be dead, and him go wid de rest of de goods and chattels to a bad master, who berry soon make him sorry him sold hisself." Pushing forward for several days in the manner of which we have attempted to describe, our travellers passed through many varied scenes, which, however, all bore one mark in common, namely, teeming animal and vegetable life. Human beings were also found to be exceedingly numerous, but not so universally distributed as the others, for although many villages and hamlets were passed, the inhabitants of which were all peacefully inclined and busy in their fields, or with their native cotton, iron, and pottery manufactures, vast expanses of rich ground were also traversed, which, as far as man was concerned, appeared to be absolute solitudes. Entering upon one of these about noon of a remarkably fine day, Harold could not help remarking on the strange stillness which pervaded the air. No sound was heard from beast, bird, or insect. No village was near. No rippling stream murmured, or zephyr stirred the leaves. In short, it was a scene which, from its solitude and profound silence, became oppressive. "Why, sir," said Disco, whose face was bathed in perspiration, "it do seem to me as if we'd got to the fag end of the world altogether. There ain't nothin' nowhere." Harold laughed, and said it looked like it, but Disco was wrong. It was only the hour when animals seem to find a siesta indispensable, and vegetables as well as air had followed their example. A few minutes sufficed to prove their mistake, for on entering a piece of woodland a herd of pallahs and another of waterbucks appeared, standing as quiet and still as if they were part of a painted landscape. Then, in passing a thick clump of thorns, they could see, through openings in the bushes, the dim, phantom like forms of buffaloes, with heads lowered and eyes glaring at them, ready to charge if need be, though too lazy from heat apparently to begin the fray, and willing to act on the principle of let be for let be. Still farther on, a native was observed keeping at a respectful distance. He had seen the travellers from afar, and come with noiseless tread to get a nearer view. Halting to rest the party for a few minutes in a shady hollow, Harold threw himself at full length on the grass, but Disco, who, strange to say, did not feel inclined to smoke at the moment, probably because he had only just finished his fifth pipe a few minutes previously, sauntered on alone to the top of the next ridge. He had barely reached the summit when Harold, who chanced to be looking after him, observed that he crouched suddenly behind a bush, and after gazing steadfastly for a few seconds over the hill, turned and ran back, making excessively wild demonstrations with head and arms, but uttering no sound. Of course the whole party sprang up and ran towards the excited mariner, and soon were near enough to understand that his violent actions were meant to caution them to make no noise. "Hush!" he said eagerly, on coming near enough to be heard. "Keep quiet as mice. There's a slave gang, or somethin' oncommon like it, goin' along on right athwart us." Without a word of reply, the whole party hurried forward, and gained a point of observation behind the low bushes which crowned the ridge. CHAPTER XV. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com